All right, so as we look at the axial skeleton, it's going to be made up of your skull, and your skull is going to have many parts associated to it. And then also your vertebral column. If we pay attention to our vertebral column, it's going to be again made out of all those irregular bones, the vertebra, traveling all the way down. It is the one that makes up the vertebral cavity that is very posterior. And also, it has a responsibility. You'll notice that this is a vertebra, and it's actually holding a rib on our illustration here. And so some of these vertebrae are responsible for creating the rib cage or for holding it together, and we'll see that today as well. And so you can see why the rib cage is even considered part of the vertebral, or part of the axial skeleton, pardon. Keep in mind that everything you're seeing in yellow is bone made by osteocytes. And then everything that you're seeing in blue is cartilage made by chondrocytes and chondroblasts, which are all trapped in little lacuna. What is the cartilage that we encounter here? Hyaline cartilage. And what was the one that we find between the discs? Fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage. And so as we move forward today, we begin at the skull. When we look at the skull, you can break it apart into two segments. One is considered cranial and the other side is facial. Cranial is going to be all the bones that are in contact with the brain, essentially. And facial bones are going to be all the bones that make up your face, simply. And as we look at these, you can see that you can break it apart, and you can even break these bones apart from each other. And so a lot of us may have interpreted that the skull is like a helmet, just one piece, but it's actually many pieces coming together and then wrapping and protecting your brain. You can see even on this model is there to represent that you can see that there is this whole skeleton broken completely apart because the skull is made out of these individual pieces. And so something that we all have to do is learn our outer flat bones. When we look at our outer flat bones, our first one is our frontal bone. And this one's pretty easy, right? This is one that we should all understand and know. It's named after the frontal region. There are two outer bones that are called the parietal bone, and these are going to be considered the most outer bones, and that's why you can see that it is the most outer flat bone out of all of them. And that one exists on both sides. You can see that if we look at the posterior view of the skull, you can see the left parietal bone and the right parietal bone. So it has two of these, and it only has one frontal and one occipital. And so one frontal and one occipital. The next one that's also paired is your temporal bone. Your temporal bone exists on two sides, and so it's hard to see it on this one, but you can see it from a posterior, and in this case, just keep in mind that it's one that you're going to be able to see on the lateral side of the skull. So this one exists where you have an ear hole. Think about it simply. And so if you have an ear hole, you technically have two of these, and so that means that the temporal bone is going to create it, but we don't call it ear hole. I'm just sort of using that for simplicity. And so, let's keep moving forward. When we look at the flat bones of the cranial bones, you'll see that they are all separated by what looks like stitches. And so these stitches are referred to as sutures. They are classified, as we're going to see in lecture today, as a joint. This is a type of joint. Because remember that the definition of a joint is that it's one bone meeting another one. And so you can see this parietal bone is meeting our occipital bone. And so this is a suture joint. And so each one of the sutures have a name depending on where it's at. And so the one that separates the occipital bone from the other parietal ones is called lambdoid suture. Lambdoid suture. And as we look at the very top of the skull, you'll see that there's one that runs in a longitudinal direction, in this direction, And this is called the sagittal suture because it makes a sagittal line straight across the skull. So this is a pretty easy suture as well. Here's the lambdoid suture we just saw, separating occipital from the rest. And then you can see, just like planes themselves, it's named the frontal suture, or mostly coronal suture is the more common and the more popular name of this bone. And so this is called the frontal suture or coronal suture. With that in mind, as we look, one of the regions that become the most difficult with dealing with this bones is dealing with these two here. There is a bone that is in your cheekbone, what we call normally the cheekbone, and this is called the zygomaticus. Zygomaticus. So sorry, your zygomatic bone. Pardon, I'm thinking about a muscle. Zygomatic bone. Zygomatic bone. And so your zygomatic bone is going to be the cheekbone. Now, if you look at your list, if you look under zygomatic bone, you'll see that it has a bone marking called the temporal process. That's what's in orange here. And it's named after the fact that this area is a little bit of the part of the bone that's going to reach for that temporal bone. And that's why it's called temporal process. And then the opposite holds true here for this temporal bone, that when we look at this zygomatic arch, you'll see that this segment here on the temporal bone, just this portion that reaches for the zygomatic bone, this part is called zygomatic process. And that's down here for you. So the zygomatic arch, and we should all take out our skulls out of your boxes, actually. Take your boxes out from the front of your cubbies. And one person go to the back and grab a colored skull as well from that left-hand side. Every bench should have one of those. Oh, yes. Very good. And so there's going to be a difficulty in your journey for the skull, because one of the first things you have to do is you have to be able to identify these bones without color. And so this colored skull is there to guide you, but you have to be able to recognize it on the one without any color. And I have pictures of this skull, and they're already posted for you as well, so do not worry about taking photos yourself. And so with that in mind, let's go over some of the actual bone markings, but just keep in mind that I like to go over the bones and then go over all the markings despite no matter what bone they fall under. And so that's why you want to make sure that we go through each one of these terms on your list, but remember that as you look at these notes, it will tell you exactly that it is a bone marking, and it'll tell you which bone it's on. All right, so with that, remember as we learn these bones, keep in mind of like a map, you have to make sure that you know where one begins and one ends. And so use these sutures to get you started. And so this suture now that separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone is going to be called the squamous suture. And so this squamous suture is going to be lateral or on the side of the head, by the ear hole, lateral, and then lambdoid is going to be much more posterior, separating the occipital bone. And this should be second nature, like the words occipital and frontal by now. The next thing that we can visualize from this view on our temporal bone is that ear hole that I jokingly call the ear hole, but it's actually called the external acoustic meatus. You may use external auditory meatus, whichever one you prefer. And again, this is a bone marking of the temporal bone, a feature of that bone. And so it's just going to be that opening that you can see on the side of the skull. Next, you'll see that that same bone has this very pointy process. Last week, we saw the word styloid process, which usually means a pointed end. And so styloid process in this context is going to be, again, a pointed end that's going to exist on the temporal bone, on the temporal bone. And as we look at this segment now, you'll see that there's this bone that embeds itself in the very center here called the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone. And this sphenoid bone is going to be, again, embedded in between all these bones. It is one of the most difficult bones to see, and I only want you to start getting used to seeing it. And this is pronounced S-F. N-O-D, like this. Sphenoid for simplicity. Sphenoid. Just make an S like hiss like a snake, and then go sphenoid. Sphenoid. And so this bone is very complicated because it is embedded deeply within all of these bones. So this one we'll have to actually remove and see it visually separate. But I really want you to see separately the zygomatic bone, which is your cheekbone, and then also it's going to be connected to the sphenoid bone. Next, we have this other little bone that, again, I just want you to be acquainted with the name of the bone right now, not too much focus on it, ethmoid bone. If you have your colored skulls, I want you to pass it around and make sure that everybody sees the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. These are the two hardest bones. Once you address those, everything else is easy. Those are the two hardest ones to understand.
Is there like a word to memorize besides like you know how for stylo you said appointed ends? Is there a word like a word?
For sphenoid and ethmoid,
No?
I can't think of one. I can't think of anyone. I had to memorize them by like that, just kind of flat out. I wonder. I want to say something, but I'm being recorded and I'm afraid of being wrong. But what I will say is, I don't know why, but they share an oid at the end, and I don't remember why. I don't remember if they're classified under the same thing as sesamoid bones. But that doesn't sound right to me when I say it or think it. So there's an oid at the end, noid and moid. That's all I got for you so far. I'll keep thinking of brainstorming some ideas. But sphenoid and ethmoid, you got to say it enough until it gets boring and you never get it wrong. Sphenoid and ethmoid. And so as you look at your colored skull, I want you to note how you can see it from that lateral view and just a little piece of it. And I want you to also see how that ethmoid bone kind of makes up the inside of your eye socket. And so if we look at the anterior view of the skull, you can see that same sphenoid bone in purple on my screen. You can see it even makes this portion of the skull. So it actually goes from this side. Here, I'm going to draw it in actually. From this side. And again, we're just drawing attention to it right now. We're not going to put too much focus on it just yet. It is too hard. Kind of a hard bone. But I just want you to see it now. And so you can see on my screen that I drew in black for some reason. Let me switch it to a better, more visually easy color. There we go. And so you can see that in red here, the sphenoid bone reaches from all the way from the left over here, all the way to the right, even forming a little bit of your eye socket. Even your eye socket itself is not a little bowl, a perfect little bowl. It's actually made out of different bones, including that zygomatic bone we just learned about, the cheekbone that we see on each side. And so if we look at this orbital has, again, that ethmoid bone in green, and more on this in a little bit. And so when we address this orbital, you'll see that the very top of it is the frontal bone. The bottom, really the third of it, is almost the zygomatic bone. And then we have our upper jaw bone. And you'll see that your upper jaw bone, referred to as the maxilla, which is a facial bone, not a cranial bone, it actually goes up and actually forms the bottom part of your orbital. And that's what this orange little piece here, it's showing you that even your maxilla, your upper jaw, makes up a majority of, or the bottom end of your orbital on both sides. Keep in mind that this maxilla is a two-sided bone. It's two different bones. It's separated here. So this is one bone. This is a separate bone. So you technically have two maxilla. So even as you go through this, I know that in the beginning of all the lecture notes, we saw that, oh, there's 206 bones. But really, it's kind of, some of them are doubled. So it's really like, if you're thinking about it in individual sense, there's approximately, I think the number was 126 total terms, but some of them double up. That's why we have to, there's more terms at the end of the day. And don't quote me on that, I'll give you the exact number in a little bit. And so here, when you look here at this nasal bone, this nasal bone is going to be the easiest one. It's going to make up the bridge, what you know as the bridge of your nose, the very top portion here. And so now within this eye socket, and again, we're not really drawing too much attention to the sphenoid bone. We just need to see that it exists. And the ethmoid bone, we need to see that it exists. But something that's created when they unite together, when they form their joints with each other, is that you can see that they leave these open spaces that when you look at the eyes of your skull, you'll see three openings. You'll see a little circle close to the nose. That little circle is called the optic canal, as you're seeing here. Optic canal. I'm going to write OC on my skull. Shoot, let me pick a better color here for the screen. OC. Make it a little brighter. Can I make this brighter? Custom. Here. OC. And this is going to be referred to again as the optic canal. And then you'll see another opening, which is going to be the highest one compared to the other one. This one's going to be running kind of along, a little bit more parallel to the ground. And so they share a name. They're called superior and inferior orbital fissure, like this. Superior orbital fissure, inferior orbital fissure. Again, what you want to see is that there's an opening at the top, an opening at the bottom, and the one on top is going to be superior, the one on the bottom, inferior orbital fissure, and this one, superior orbital fissure. And so that's the difference. There's two openings, and that's what you want to note in your skull. Don't let this confuse you. Note these three openings, study this well. It's pretty easy once you see it, and it kind of makes everything seem not so crazy in the eye socket. But those are the three structures to sort of that are going to be a hurdle for a little bit. And so, with that in mind, those are the only three openings, and the optic canal will give rise or allow the optic nerve to exit from there, and that's how your eye stays. There's going to be an eyeball in here, and that eyeball is connected by nervous tissue called the optic nerve, connected to your brain, and it comes out from that little opening. And so we move on from here. And then this one will allow other nerves that control the muscles of the eye as well. And so as we move on, we're not done with our orbital yet. There's this sneaky little bone that you'll see that if you look at it within your skull, your colored skulls, in Spanish, what's the word for tear? Lagrima. And so that word comes from the Latin root lacrima. And so lacrimal bone is essentially your crying bone. So if you've taken some high school Spanish, you might have encountered that word before. So hopefully that might help you with that. Lacrimal bone, lagrima. And if you look very closely at your skulls, there'll always be like a little groove in that lacrimal bone, and that's called the lacrimal duct. And so what that is, it's kind of like a sewer system for your tears. That when you cry, your tears fall down your eyeball in this direction, and then they drain down like a sewer system through that little hole called the lacrimal duct, the lacrimal canal. And then when you cry, what happens? After a little bit of crying, what happens with your nose? It starts running, and that's because the tears are draining through your nose. So it's sort of, again, like a little sewage system exiting out of your lacrimal bone. And so with that, the next thing to address is we have to address the opening that we find within the nasal opening that you see here. This opening, more than likely, you're probably going to hear it being called a vestibule, because a vestibule is anything that just has an open space, but that doesn't matter. What I'm just going to say simply is that this is the inside of your nasal cavity. And something to note that's special about your nasal cavity is that it has all these grooves inside. Your nose has this special ability to condition the air outside of it. meaning that when you breathe in through your nose, you actually condition the outside air to the temperature of your internal body temperature. And so, because of that, your body temperature doesn't fluctuate very much, and that's another unique way that your body maintains homeostasis. And this is how most mammals tend to do that very same thing. So you can see how very long snouted animals that sort of just survive on their own fur really rely on a little bit of that conditioning of the air, and also they need to be able to be more receptive to molecules for food molecules, right? Smell molecules, the carbs and proteins coming off of dead animals that, that they need to eat. And so that cavern system is created by the unity of a few bones. One of them we already know, the ethmoid bone. We don't know it too well, we just know it exists. And you'll see that this ethmoid bone plays a role also in this nasal cavity. It forms a structure that this top half, as you look at your skull, there's going to be something that looks like it's one piece all the way down. Even as you look at your skull assistants, if they're facing you, you can probably see that they're just this line that goes from the top to the bottom. But the top 2/3 is called the perpendicular plate. And you see that it comes from the ethmoid bone. One of the tougher things to get started with. And this perpendicular plate, again, comes from the bone, the ethmoid bone, buried deep between all these bones that we just learned about. If we look at the bottom half, there is this weird looking bone that you're going to have to take apart more than likely your colored skulls in a little bit, is that you're going to see that this vomer is going to be look like a little sharp, little blade-like, tool-like looking bone, and then it's called a vomer. And this is an actual bone. I'm going to put this here to remind you. It's a bone, not a bone marking, it's a bone. And so this is as it compares to the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the temporal bone. It has its own bone name, but it doesn't have any bone markings that you need to know. So it's just the vomer bone. That's all you need to know. And so remember, on the exam, for safety's sake, if they ask you at the top half, I'm going to make sure that this is how it's set up when I get in there, is that if they set up for this question, if they place it at the top half, for the bone marking, what are you answering? Perpendicular plate. If it's pointing to this same place and they say, ID the bone, what are you answering? Nice, ethmoid bone. And down here, they ask you for bone marking, what are you answering? What would you be answering if they asked for for the bone marking? What would you do on your test? Nothing. You would leave it blank because there is no bone marking there. All right, you only need to know the vomer. So that's the take home. This is an actual bone. The name of the bone is ethmoid. The name of just this part of the bone, this bone marking, is perpendicular plate. Exactly. And so to sum up this last region, is that visually there is a ridge up here that you can't see because of your nasal bone. But if I pretend like this is see-through right now, you would actually see a groove that looks exactly like this, and it would be in green for you, just like the other one, like this one here. Oops. Just like this one here. It would look just like that up here. And that one, all of these grooves that you're seeing, these grooves, that cavern system, there are 3, and they're easy to name. Superior, middle, and inferior. That's it. And so this one, superior, good news, you do not need. So you do not need the superior orbital fissure. I'll double check your list, but you do not need that one. And so really we begin at middle. That's going to be the first green ones that we see there, middle, with the ones with the X's. And then finally, the inferior nasal concha. Concha, if I'm not mistaken, in Latin means conch. Did they make you guys read Lord of the Flies in high school? Yeah, I remember when they had to blow into that seashell. That's a conch because it blows wind and it circulates air. That's exactly what your nose kind of does. It allows the air to circulate. So concha, that's kind of where it comes from. I don't know if that'll help you remember it, but concha.
Is the inferior nasal made of the ethmoid bone as well?
Repeat that for me one more time.
Is the inferior nasal concha made of the ethmoid
Yes,
bone?
precisely right. That middle nasal one is coming from the ethmoid bone. And you'll notice that this one, the inferior one, it's in blue here. So using our diagram, what do we know it's coming from? The zygomatic. You can see that zygomatic has a funny shape to it on the inside. And so this really does become the hard part, is making sure that you address the colored model you have and making sure you know the bones first before you go into the individual features. Once you know the color-coded scheme, the way you see it on these pictures, whether it's frontal view, lateral view, superior view, occipital view, posterior view, I promise that this becomes a lot easier. This is your first task, really. Know the bone names, then go to bone markings. Promise it'll save you some time. And so with that, some other features that these bones have that I'm just going to talk about individually because they kind of are nice to talk about in a paired manner. For example, you'll notice that this bone marking is on the frontal bone. And another one that sounds very familiar is going to be on the maxilla bone. And so it's easier to ignore the bone names right now because they have a similar name. The word foramen in Latin from now on means opening. And I'm going to actually clarify this because we're all learning this. I'm going to put see-through opening. There's a reason for that new. Oops. My leg fell asleep. There's a double N in here. Where is it? Opening. Is there a double N? No, there isn't. Thank you very much. Opening. Or again, holes. Maybe easier for some holes. Okay. And so that's what the word foramen is. The good news is you're going to see it everywhere. So on the exam, if you don't know one of them, you can kind of guess. And I'll give you a reason. There's a difference between canal and foramen. We'll describe it when it comes time in a second. And so if you look at your skulls, you'll see that there are these little openings on all of them. And so if it's above the orbital, it's called supraorbital foramen. And that means to run above orbital opening. And then the other one that's relatable is infraorbital foramen, because again, running below the orbit, the orbital, the eye, and again, foramen meaning opening. And so you can see that you have an opening up top, the orbital, and below. Let the orbit remind you of the name. Supraorbital and infraorbital foramen. Pardon, say again? It says see-through openings or see-through holes. And then the difference now, we might as well address it now, that the canal, when we see the word canal, typically it's called this because it means like tunnel. Tunnel. Like think about if you saw the beginning of a gopher hole, can you see the exit out of it? You really can't, because what does he do between the dirt? He makes like a little maze under the ground. So that would be a canal because it's a pathway, but it's not a direct see-through opening like the way that I'm looking through my fingers right now and I'm looking at all of you. Like this is a foramen. A canal would be something that goes like a tube that goes down and I can't see the other side because it has some bend in it. That's all the difference is. And so we'll see an example of it a little bit later. And so with that, we move on now to our inferior view of our skull. This is a view you do not want to neglect. This is a view that you want to make sure that you do once you know all the color code scheme. You want to tell yourself step 2 is look at the inferior view. It is the most neglected thing to do. I understand why. It's exhausting even just looking at it. And so let's start from the anterior side. Here, this first part is going to be the upper jaw. What we're seeing right now is the lower jaw, this lower jaw removed, and we're looking upwards into your upper jaw. And so as you look at your upper jaw, you're seeing the palatine, your palate. This is what we call the hard palate. If you use your tongue right now and you touch your two front teeth, And though you drag your old way to the very back, you'll eventually feel this very, very soft part. That's here. When you touch that soft part with your tongue, that's called the soft palate because it's really made of tissue. And then here, soft tissue, soft tissue. And then when you touch this part with you're touching really bone. You're touching bone tissue. And so this is why when they say, oh, I got to clear my palate in fancy cooking food shows and stuff, it's because they got to clear the taste in their mouth. And so the palate, again, we're talking about this hard part of your upper jaw. 2/3 of it comes from the maxilla, is made by the maxilla of your upper palate, of your hard palate. 2/3. And then the last 1/3 of your hard palate is going to be made by your palatine bone, named after that fact. I don't know why I wrote it. It's already there. Palatine bone. 1/3. And so that's going to be this last 1/3 here. I know it doesn't look like exactly 1/3, but that's what the literature calls it for the most part. We'll describe it as. So again, 2/3 and palatine. Again, it's just this little piece. This is another sneaky little bone along with the vomer. And then you'll also be able to visualize that vomer right behind it. And that's how tiny it is. You're seeing the bottom of the vomer. Make sure you take some time to look at your vomer and to look at the palatine bone that make up the upper roof of your mouth. Next thing to do is to remember that this zygomatic bone reaches for that temporal bone, and then they create an arch that is best seen from this view. This view is called the zygomatic arch, this whole structure is called the zygomatic arch. But remember, the part that reaches is going to be called the zygomatic process. The zygomatic bone is going to have a temporal process. The zygomatic process is going to be on the temporal bone. And it's going to be reaching for the zygomatic bone. Okay, so that's one of the hurdles in learning this. Next. If we look at the base of the skull, you'll see all these terms again. Foramen, they come up again. Look, there's foramen, I'm going to underline it. Foramen. And you don't have to do it on your paper just yet. I'll show you why in a second. Foramen, 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 foramen. And if you look at foramen, just by guessing, what is a foramen again? A hole or an opening. So you can see you can get half credit if you don't remember the name of something, but you remember it's an opening or a hole, you can get half credit for writing foramen. So the word foramen becomes an essential vocab word for survival on this exam. Foramen. And remember, foramina is plural. You'll hardly see that word right today, or me using it just to make things easier, but just keep that in mind. And there's a way to approach these in a very simple way when you do them together. Because if you try to say, okay, these foramen are coming out of the purple one, the sphenoid bone, which, by the way, you can also see the sphenoid bone from the bottom. Like I said, this is the toughest bone we're going to address last, and it sits perfectly in the middle. You can see it from the top. You can see it, you can't see it from the top. Yeah, you can technically see it from the top. I'll show you why. Top, side, bottom. You can see it from everywhere. And so on the bottom, you can see it has its own foramen. You can see that the temporal bone has its own foramen. You can see the occipital bone has its own foramen. It's easier to learn it as a map, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. I just want you to keep that in mind right now, that the wholes we're learning together. And with that, am I missing any other terms? Yes, I am. And so we are finishing up the skull, and the last thing to add is that your list doesn't have it, so we're going to add it here. But I know, your list, your notes don't have, but I know it's on your list. There's a term here. If we look at, this color cannot be seen on this color. Let's do yellow. That if we look at this structure, there's going to be a nubby region here. If you touch like behind your ears, and you feel that bone right behind, that's that. That's called your mandibular. Oh, no, not your mandibular. Sorry, your oh my goodness. Mastoid process. Mastoid process. Sorry, brain fart. And so that's going to be, again, the region behind your ear. The best way to remember this is that when you look at the slide, it says mastoid process. M-A-S-T, mastoid. T. Isn't there a way to, draw? Whoops. Yeah, like that. Oh, cool. Okay, cool. Mastoid process. And so mastoid process. And again, look at where we're at right here. This opening is our external auditory meatus, which again, the ear hole to you call it, remember it? And this structure is right behind. I give you this because you might encounter in physio that this is a bone structure you need to know in order to understand a certain type of deafness. And so it'll be relevant in the future in physio. So it's worth bringing into this class. And then the last structure on this overall thing that we're going to address from this view is that if we look at our occipital bone, it's always easier to see it from the inferior because it has that huge opening called easily foramen magnum for that reason. And then finally, there's going to be these little, what I call like little landing pads, right? Because if the skull's like an airplane, it has to land exactly on the first vertebral bone, C1, the first cervical bone. You have 7 in that region, and so the first one it's going to make contact with is called C1, or it's called atlas. We'll talk about that in a bit. And so those landing pads for the vertebra are called the occipital condyle. And recall that the word condyle, we experienced this word, it means a rounded meeting site. That's actually the perfect way to describe it. Yes, rounded meeting site. That's what all condyles are. And so you'll notice in the humerus, the trochlea and the capitulum were considered condyles. They're both rounded meeting sites. Rounded meeting sites. Or so that they can meet the next 2 bones, the ulna and the radius, roughly. And so, one last thing to address on this photo that I'm just seeing. Our mandible has to connect to this. It needs a site of attachment. And so, easily, is this on the temporal bone, we can see our mandibular fossa. A site or a meeting site or an indentation or an indented meeting site. That's actually exactly what fossa really kind of means. Indented. It's an N, sorry, indented meeting site. Does this thing get in the way when does it show it? It does, huh? Oh, never mind. Let me make it more complicated. No, it doesn't. Oh, it's only my screen that goes nuts. Okay. How do you take it off? Cool. Uh-oh. Okay, sorry. Technical difficulties. Sorry. Okay. All right, I'll play with it later. All right, so next let's move on from here. I think we addressed everything. And then we were not done with the superior view, because now what I need you to all do is open up your skulls, and you want to actually visualize this, right? That's what you're doing with all your skulls, is that you are essentially creating a plane. What kind of plane is this? Transverse. And so we make a transverse view of the skull. Yeah, yours might have a hook. You might have to like unhook it and then it comes off. Be very gentle with them. And so we have to start addressing those foramen. And so the first thing you want to do is that you want to create a map. So what you're seeing here is that you're seeing all the circles open, like highlighted for you. And so there's one that you have to add, and that's going to be here in its circle. It's going to be the optic canal. This optic canal is an opening that we saw in the very beginning when we looked at the front of the orbital. This was our optic canal, which I just simply called OC for short. You'll see why in a second. You can see that when you look at the superior view of the skull. If you look at these openings, you can actually see a little hole there. That's your optic canal. Now your margins, there should be enough space on the margin of your paper to do a little map. And this is a map you want to write somewhere on your paper. So for this right side, it would be OC. Let me do this. And then, sorry, I'll make it larger right now. OCR. And then OSL parentheses CC. And then we're going to make a little hill here. A little hill. We're going to put IAM. And then we're going to put JF. And you are done. And so, let's do it on the other side too. I'll explain what this is in a second. R. Okay. So they're supposed to be even. I'm going to try my best. I just ran out of space. But they're supposed to look exactly identical from left side. And let me do a different color here to separate my text. Here. So this would be your right side. And this would be your left side. And so I have the luxury that my last name is Rosa, right? Like pink or rose in Spanish. Here, R-O-S. So it's kind of easy for me to remember this little bit. So your Professor Rosa, I don't know if that'll help. And then my first name is Luis, so it's always been really easy, L-R-O-S. And then here, I just had the CC. I just neglect that A. I don't know if that'll help you, but it helps me. So when you look at this is nothing but a map of the openings that you're seeing. If you can remember this mental map or just do one side, you can kind of guess the other side. And it is easy because they are named after certain things. Like, for example, this one is going to be called oval, which sounds like which shape?
Oval.
Nice and easy. And so if you look at all of these skulls, you'll see this perfectly oval little shaped hole. Let me use this marker. Perfectly oval shape. And then you'll see a tiny little circular one. And that tiny little circular one is going to be the S, or what we know as spinosum. And so all you have to do is remember that part, because you know it's a hole, so all you're missing from the word is foramen oval, foramen spinosum, foramen rotundum. This is the only unicorn out of these. You can call it optic foramen for the first exam, or optic canal. This one I don't care what you call it, because I'm not actually sure. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be optic canal, but I'm seeing on our text always a foramen, which I found on the screen, but it's there, so remember it however way you want. But for safety, I would say foramen, because foramen, that's 50% of them already. And so, optic foramen, foramen rotundum, foramen oval, foramen spinosum, and now this is the trick. When you get to spinosum, when you see that oval shape and you see that little circular one right underneath it, you go straight to the midline of the skull, and then you see that huge opening. That's going to be lacerum. That's the starter. It's the huge one that you see. And then attached to it is going to be another opening that goes in the opposite direction. I'm actually going to put that arrow there to remind you of that. It goes in the opposite direction. It goes, again, in that direction towards where it came from in a way, from the O and the S. And that's going to be another opening called the carotid canal. So you're only going to be able to really see it on the real skulls, because the plastic or the 3D printed ones, they can't create that kind of uniqueness. And so in this case, this one, the real skulls, you'll see that when you find lacerum, it'll be the large clear opening. And then when you look at an angle, you'll see that there's some sort of tunnel going in that direction. That's called the carotid canal. Carotid canal. And all of these words are spelled for you in the bottom of your page here. And so carotid canal there, carotid canal. And so if we use our little map now, you can see that all I do really is I just think, visualize that mind map, mental model there, and I just think OC, rotundum, OS. I go to the middle, and then I see lacerum. And then you can see that it's the same for the other side, OC, R, OS, and then L is the clear one. And then you can see that there's going to be this little groove that goes towards the ear. That's going to be the carotid canal. And that's why I have it in parentheses, because it's going to look directly like a part of that one, the lacerum, of foramen lacerum. And so I use the first letter of each one of these to make this mental map. If you know this side, you know the other side, right? We finished this top part. And now you kind of guess the rest of how this is all going to work. So what is this landmark? There's a term that you're not responsible for on this class. This is called the petrous part. And when you look at it on the bone, it sort of looks like it has an uphill and then a downhill. Or even simpler, you can pinch this. Like you can pinch this part of the bone, and it feels like you created that part. Like when you go to this region, you can pinch this groove all the way down. And when you pinch it, you'll see that there is a little tiny opening. That first opening you encounter is going to be your internal acoustic meatus. And this word sounds familiar because it's the exact same thing as the external acoustic meatus. The ear hole from the outside, it has to have a way to exit from the inside, or you need sort of an exit hole, and that's going to be the internal acoustic meatus. So if I crawl through this little opening, I would be able to crawl out of the external acoustic meatus. Then I go in through the external acoustic meatus, and I got rid of all the structures involved in there, and then I technically go straight into that internal acoustic meatus. And then when you go more down, right, like this is going to be more superior, the internal acoustic meatus, and then when you go a little bit more down below, heading towards the foramen magnum, there will be this large kidney bean shaped one. This doesn't do it justice, this picture, but your packet on your skeletal models has it really, 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 really nice here. It always looks like a huge kidney bean, because the jugular foramen looks like a very lazy artery. He's not perfectly circular. It's like flat and elongated. And so it runs from right there. And so if you look at our map, let's see, we get rid of this. Can I get rid of this? Do I need this? Let me make a copy of this just in case. And duplicate. Copy. Okay, cool. And so if you want to draw it on your skulls or this map, this is exactly how I visualize it on this one. And this should keep you safe on the exam for the openings. You'll even see that your study list, your terms list, has a region that just says openings. Like it's literally just talking about the structures. Yeah, it's just talking about these openings in its own little segment. And again, if you're seeing it, OC, R, O, S, L, CC, I had to draw this one in, it doesn't look that great, and jugular foramen. And this is another one here, next to the foramen magnum, just keep in mind, but you don't need it. This is another one, so be careful with this one. This is called the hypoglossal canal. It's not this one, don't annotate it. It's called the hypoglossal canal. Carotid canal, spelled like this carotid canal. Yes, and this really does become a difficult part. So how they're going to ask this on the exam is that they're going to grab one of these pipe cleaners and they're going to place it through one of the openings and they're going to say, what bone marking is that? And you are answering foreman. All right, you are answering foreman guaranteed, but the perfect answer would be foreman oval. All right, foreman, I better see foreman if you're guessing. That's 50% right there, 50%. All right, now we have to address the elephant in the room, these two, which kind of looks like an elephant now that I look at it like this. It's like an elephant head here, the ears, and then the trunk's right here a little bit. I don't know if you guys see it. And so these two bones now have to be sort of addressed individually. The good news is that you learn the hardest part is that it has openings, it has the optic canal, it has R, O, S, and L of our little acronym up top of our map. And one thing that becomes very difficult about this bone is that, why this bone is so difficult is that you never really get to see it by itself. And that's why this image is here for you, because it's the sphenoid bone taken out from that part where it's buried in the anterior, and just the sphenoid bone. And so if we keep track of structures that we're aware of, we may not know the names, exact names yet, but we know there's an OC, we know there's an R, we know there's an O, we know there's an S, right? Like Professor Rosa here, R-O-S, there's no A. And so these are the three openings. And lacerum is right here. L. And so with that in mind, if we look at this top portion, you'll see that there was this little special region that's sort of, it looks like a throne a little bit, like a chair. These are the armrests. This is where the you would sit, the butt cheeks would sit. Then the arms are sitting here, and you're reclined on your back here. So you're looking at a chair from the top view, a superior view. And so that's kind of where the names sort of come from, like sella turcica. If I'm not mistaken, this means something along the word of throne. And so this region here where you would sit, where you would be sitting here, the chair part of the chair, the seat part of the chair, is the sella turcica, a pretty tough one to learn. Next, your optic foramen, or again, optic canal. You can learn it as OC or OF, whatever you'd like. And so this optic foramen, something that's unique about the eyes is that it has nerves that connect to the eye socket in this direction. The eye's over here. And it's larger than that, but I'm just kind of doing it a little. So the nerve goes through there, the nerve goes through there. But the thing is that this nerve, the nerve coming from this eye, it needs to send nerves to the other side of the brain. And so does this part. It also needs to send nerves to the other side. And so there's this nice little region here for that intersection called the optic groove or the optic chiasmatic, or chiasma is actually more appropriate. And so what this means is that chiasmatic in Latin means crossroads. A crossroad. They had two directions, and then this is where they cross. A segment of crossing. Maybe crossroad isn't the best. That's not the exact word, description. It's more like a site of crossing. Just site of crossing. That makes more sense. For the nerves, for nervous tissue, not related to what we're talking about. But that's what it's named after. And so it should be coming from the optic canals. The last two terms to address on this is going to be the lesser wing and the greater wing. The lesser wing is going to be the more superior portion as you descend downwards towards your oval and your spinosum. Then this is going to be your greater wing, all of this. And that's why I had it highlighted originally. And so your greater wing is in green here. Your lesser wing is going to be in red here.
The lesser part of any bone is usually the inside?
The smaller. The smaller.
Because like you know the humerus, it's like the lesser.
Lesser and greater.
Yeah, lesser.
I think it's mostly size when it comes to the words greater or lesser. Size. Muscles have that trend though. They're named a little bit more logically by size, by approximation to another thing. Like you have some muscles like carpi radialis longus, carpi radialis brevis. The first word longest means long, brevis means shorter. That's all. Like there's always something that relates to, yeah, not this case. But yeah, that's good thinking because for most topics, that's actually true for most of the time. And so this is our sphenoid bone. If we look at it from the anterior view, as if you removed all of these bones and all you're left with is this thing staring straight at you, this is what it would look like. This is what the sphenoid bone would look like if you remove all the bones, and again, a human being is just staring straight at you. And so, the only thing to be aware of is that there are some pockets of air inside of your skull. Your skull, when it unites together, it creates what we refer to as sinuses. And so right now, that space that we're talking about is called the sphenoidal sinus because you can see that there's a little pocket in here, and what's in here is a membrane that's producing mucus and also gas. It's actually just empty space, regulating intercranial pressure, the pressure in your skull. And so sometimes you'll hear people, oh, I have a sinus headache or I have a pressure headache. And it's because, yeah, you might have sort of a pressure buildup in here. And so that's why you see some individuals doing this to relieve their pressure headaches, their sinus headaches. They'll be doing this. And it sort of helps like get those little bubbles out in a way, to speak, simply. And so you'll see that you have a sinus here called sphenoidal sinus made by the sphenoid bone, a little pocket of air inside that skull. Then you have your frontal sinus, which is going to be a pocket of space in the frontal bone. Frontal sinus, sphenoidal sinus, and then you have one more called the ethmoidal sinus, which I'm not seeing on this page, so I don't think they ask it. I don't think that you have to worry about it, it looks like. All right, cool. You don't have to worry about it. And so back to this page, you don't need anything else from this term, and do not worry on the exam. For the most part, they only really take this bone out and they say, what is this bone? And they'll ask you what these structures are, sella turcica, optic groove, and maybe optic canal. But these openings, it's been my experience that they ask it in a complete skull. Because we only have one of these modes, one of these little sphenoid bones separated out, and it'll be on the left-hand side during the lab for you to check out. And so that's why we only ask 2 questions on it. So typically it's going to be like the 2 clear ones, like the wings or the ones in the center. And then the foramen are usually asked in the skulls because we have a lot of skulls. All right. So we move on from here. Now the last bone to address of the skull is our ethmoid bone. And this is looking at it from an anterior view. You're looking straight at somebody and all the bones disappear and the only thing left is this ethmoid bone, and this is what you would be seeing. And this ethmoid bone, again, is buried incredibly deeply into the skull, and you can see it from a superior view. And it's always going to have sort of like a cottage cheese appearance. On the colored skull, you'll see that there's just going to be a little segment at the front with its own little faded color, and it's going to have this little boundary straight down the middle. And so these superior view, when you look at it from the top, there's going to be all these holes, which are fortunately called cribiform foramen. And this word is pretty kind of a nightmare in the beginning, but cribiform is the name of the entire region. I'm going to highlight it. The entire region, all of it. This is a cribiform plate, cribiform plate. And then, I'm going to write that here, cribiform plate. And in green, actually, I'm going to switch colors. Let's do blue. All these openings that you're seeing, these are called cribiform foramen. And what is a plural word of this? Foramina. Plural. Because this is now a relevant time to use it. Because you can see that there's a bunch of little openings here. And think about what they are, that inside of your nasal cavity, what has to flow through all those concha that we learned about, and that perpendicular plate, and the vomer, everything inside of here, that all those molecules that you smell enter this cavity, and then they find nervous tissue. And where does nervous tissue have to send sensory information? Into the brain. And so you can see that the nerves exit out of the skull through these holes, and you just have a bunch of exits and a bunch of little tentacles reaching into your nose, aligning the walls of your nose. And as you breathe in, all those nerves send in all those signals of molecules through those holes called cribiform foramina. And they go and reach your brain, and then your brain processes the smell. Bless you. And so this bone itself has that particular uniqueness at the superior view. And if we leave off where we kind of started, that if we look at the anterior view, we're seeing the same structures up top. We're seeing our cribiform plate. And then we're seeing all the little holes called cribiform foramen, or sometimes olfactory foramen. The word olfactory in anatomy means smell. Anything smell, with the sense of smell related. And so they're openings that allow for smell receptors to exit, and that's why they're called sometimes olfactory foramina. But you can remember whatever you'd like. Cribiform plate, you have to know, so cribiform foramina I think is easier. And then you'll see something that intersects them both in the middle. This is called crista galli. Crista galli. And if you look at it from this view, this structure that cuts right in between both of them, that's the same crista galli. Crista galli. And now we're back to our nasal cavity. Nothing new here to add. The ethmoid bone creates the middle nasal concha and the perpendicular plate at the inferior part of this bone. And so this is always visual. It is visual. You are capable of visualizing this when you look at any skull and you are seeing this. This is that same perpendicular plate, that same middle nasal concha. And last thing to note is that sometimes you may see this bent on some of the models like this. What do we call this when you have this bent? Anybody know? What happens when you can only really breathe from one side? A deviated septum. The word septum means something that divides something into two halves. So even as you look at my nose right now, right, I have a nostril on this side, a nostril on this side, and something divides it from the left to the right. Same thing. This is a septum dividing left and right. And so when you say you have a deviated septum, typically from injury or drug abuse, typically you will see this bent to the side. And then you have trouble breathing, you might have to get surgery and get that bone realigned. But otherwise, that's what we refer to as deviated septum. Because if you look at it from a lateral perspective, you'll see that that same perpendicular plate coming from the ethmoid bone, again, here's the top of the skull, here's all the foramina, the cribiform foramina, sending nerves into the nasal cavity. And so you can see the top half was the perpendicular plate. It has a shape that's more like a larger wall, not really just like a line like you might think like from just the front view, but it actually goes to the back, creating a left chamber and a right chamber. So right now we're looking at the left side of the nasal cavity. You can go to the other side of the other nostril, and you can be on the other side of that septum. So again, this septum, this along with the vomer create two halves inside of your nasal cavity, a left side and a right side. The perpendicular plate and the vomer divide it into halves. And so that's kind of a nice little take home there too. With that in mind, I believe we now move on to our mandible. Anything to add here? These are our sinuses without any color. And again, you don't need ethmoid sinus because I'm not seeing it, but there is, again, your frontal sinus and sphenoidal sinus. And then what we need to add here is, remember, when we were looking at those concha, remember there was a middle and an inferior view that you can see from the front of the skull, but if you were giving a sagittal section of the skull, you're looking at the actual cavern inside of the nose, and so superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. That's what it looks like when you look at it from a side view. And that's that cavern system inside of your nasal cavity that I'm talking about. And always remember, our ethmoid bone forms the roof of your nasal cavity because it has all those nerve fibers coming down into your nose so that you can smell everything you like. And then here's your mouth. This is where you eat. And then the mandible now. The mandible is, it's a one piece, even though the maxilla was two. That's something that's easy to confuse. But the mandible is technically only one piece, so don't look for two mandibles. You shouldn't be looking for one. And as you look for it, remember that condyle means a rounded meeting site. This is going to be the site where it finds the temporal bone. It is called the mandibular condyle. It is also called the head of the mandible. But I think mandibular condyle is better because condyle means rounded meeting site. And now let's address that structure. The mandibular condyle looks for the mandibular fossa. So that condyle looks for the fossa. See that trend when we saw the humerus bone? It had condyles and fossas. This fossa is a little dip, and it's a little meeting site, and that condyle fits nice and snug into there. So you have two on each side. When we say you have a broken jaw, a dislocated jaw, more than likely it means that the mandible, that part where it connects, like even as you go to your skulls and you probably look at that bottom, it means that this one disconnected from the actual temporal bone. The joints, they separated, dislocated. And so the mandibular fossa meets that mandibular condyle. Let's see. And then as we make our way downwards from that condyle, there'll be this region we refer to as the ramus. And this, if I draw it in, it's going to be sort of a downward rectangle. That's the best way to think about it. Well, not really. More like a, let's say like this. Lateral rectangle? I don't know what to call it. And then this body, I would say, I didn't draw this too perfectly. Here. So I would say, let's do it like this. Ramus here. Yep. And so body is everything highlighted there in red, and ramus is going to be this. Yes, and body's everything down here. That's the difference. Ramus means to connect things in a way. So it's connecting the condyle to the body. Kind of like a neck in a way in this instance. Then at the very posterior portion, you'll see an opening on the inside of that mandible called the mandibular foramen. This is where they do injections of lidocaine when they need to numb your mouth for dental surgery. You have nerves that run through there. And it shuts off all the access to all these nerves. So that's where they typically place it. And then remember that the chin in regional anatomy was mental, and so there's an opening on your chin called mental foramen. And there's one on each side, both sides. And then a tooth, nice and easy. And then when we get to digestive, we'll break down the teeth a little more. When you look underneath that mandible, there's this secret little swallowing, this bone specialized in swallowing your food daily. Even right now, if you were to swallow air, swallow saliva, you'll feel in your throat, you'll feel something go, and then sort of like grab, reach, and come right back. That's what this bone does. There's this bone that if you look at all your skeletons, if you elevate them a little bit, there's this little shoe horse bone that kind of you're seeing on your packet on the right-hand side. And so it goes like this, and what it does is that it's floating in midair, so hanging by muscles only and ligaments. It's not attached to other muscles, to other bones. It's a bone connected to other muscles or ligaments, no other bone like the rest of that. So it's kind of, they call it kind of floating. And so the muscles are sort of moving it around as necessary, and it secures swallowing. When you're about to eat and you swallow, this elevates forward, grabs your food, and sort of pushes it down your esophagus, which is going to go down into your stomach. And so it guides it and brings it forward, and so that's the hyoid bone. And it has tiny little horns on it, the lesser one and the greater one. And then this portion, anything here, is just called the body. The way you're seeing is just body. And there will be a lot of muscles we have to learn based off of this bone, so make sure you learn it well. Hyoid bones. And then before the break, we have to finish our fetal skull. And so when we look at the skulls of fetuses, and I'll bring them up to the front in a second. I forgot where they're at. But if you look at this structure, the head, the fetal structures, the skeleton, you'll see they have the same low areas, the same flat bones. We have frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bone. And again, these are named after the same brain regions. So if you log these away, you're learning the regions of the brain today as well. Remember that the brain, fully grown adults, had sutures which combine the parietal and the temporal bone, but this is what's different about fetal skulls and infant skulls, is that their sutures haven't fully developed. A lot of you may have held infants, and when they say don't touch the skull, or when you touch it, it's very soft, and that's because those sutures haven't completely connected yet. It's still connective tissue. It's not a very strong connective tissue attachment just quite yet. It's more loose, more than anything. And so these loose bits of connective tissue regions, where the sutures should be, are called fontanelles. And so an easy one first, you have your sphenoidal fontanelle, because it's next to the sphenoid bone. And you're seeing a little bit of that sphenoid bone, because remember, that bone is very visual from a lot of perspectives, including the lateral side. And so you can see the color of the bone, flat bones are essentially the same of a grown adult. The only difference is now you're not really caring much about sutures. You are, but you really care about fontanelles now. And so if we look at a superior view, which I think is a little bit easier at first, frontal suture, and then anterior fontanelle, which is sort of, again, going to be a crossroad between the sagittal suture and the frontal suture. And something I want you to know is that you'll notice that the frontal bones, there's two right now. How many does an adult have? One. And so this completely disappears in an adult, this frontal suture. And this becomes one bone. Well, they technically all disappear, and they all become just the sutures that we learned in the beginning of class. And then the anterior fontanelle is going to be that soft spot that they always say, that they're kind of the top of the head, and again, going to be leaning more towards the anterior side. And then the sagittal suture is going to be that same suture we saw that runs on a sagittal line. And then the lambdoid suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal bones. That was its characteristic before. And right in the middle, right before that lambdoid suture becomes a sagittal suture, at that site, that cross, now it's appropriate to use the word crossroad. At the crossroad, a fontanelle. So you have a posterior fontanelle and an anterior fontanelle at every single crossroad. Right, you're going, where do I go? Left or right? Fontanelle. And then up there, again, your coronal suture. And so, and so this is the exact skeleton we used, and the fontanelles labeled for you. All right. So go ahead and I'm gonna pause.